gets the most mileage out of it. So with that in mind, the other important factors to consider, what are dosing considerations, drug interaction potentials? Is there a reason to consider that cannabis constituents warrant contraindication? And of course, we want to frequently update it so we stay at the cutting edge of what the data has to offer. Now here, a brief difference of 5 of the most common repositories that we utilize when we pull data and include them into the Cannakeys data bank. PubMed, you can find pretty much any abstract if it was published after 1966. PubMed Central is a great addition. It publishes full-length studies, but only published after the year 2000. Cochrane is great because they primarily focus on clinical trials, and then ResearchGate is another really good one, which is kind of a combination between a social media site and a research repository. And if you ever wanted to reach out to an author of a trial, I suggest go to ResearchGate, and they make it very easy to reach out. And I have had really good, like 8 out of 10 times I'd ask a specific questions about a key finding or something related to a study that they had authored. I would get a response typically, fairly quickly. Google Scholar also is useful, especially if you like to hunt for PDFs and create your own filing system with complete studies. But so these are the broad and primary differences between the key repositories that we frequently visit and utilize. Now, one of the key tools that that we use at Cannakeys has to do with utilizing a double-weighted mean, and we found it a very useful tool to provide context and easy to access at your fingertips information from a bird's eye view or taking a global perspective. And to very briefly just look at the way we specifically employ a double weighted means. The first weight is given to each individual trials that is entered into the Cannakeys data bank. So a lab test, a Petri dish test, gets a weight of a 1 because only roughly about 10% of all data that comes out of lab tests eventually becomes relevant in the clinical setting. Now, animal studies, of course, get a slightly higher weight, and depending on who you talk to, the clinical relevance of animal trials are somewhere between 10 and 50%. And then reviews, preclinical meta-analyses, case studies, and expert opinions get a 3, and then all the way up, and now here's the invisible barrier or line between preclinical and clinical trials. There are non-controlled trials, randomized trials, and then, of course, the gold standard, the meta-analyses of clinical trials, getting the heaviest weight of the initial first weight that we apply towards each study. The second weight that we apply has to do with the key findings of every individual trial. So here's what it would look like for Alzheimer's disease. Here we have lab tests, animal trials, and then meta-analyses getting the heaviest weight. So the way we employ the key finding weight is simple. If the study says that yes, as cannabis-based therapeutics have shown to mitigate the underlying pathology of Alzheimer's disease, we multiply whatever that first weight was by a +1. If it says no, it actually makes it contributes or makes the underlying pathology worse, it gets multiplied by a -1. And if it has mixed or inconclusive results, it gets multiplied by a 0. Now then we add up all of the all of the findings, and we end up with the total number of studies. And so what we'll do then is we'll simply divide the total, the sum total by the total number of studies, and we arrive at a number between 1 and 6. So down here is what that translates to. A rating up to 2 means that there's possible efficacy, that cannabis or cannabis constituents may present efficacy in the treatment context of Alzheimer's disease. If it's a 2 to 4, it's probable, and if there is a rating of 4 and higher, there is actual evidence in the clinical setting indicating that it has therapeutic efficacy in the treatment context of whatever condition you're looking for, and in this case, Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is what the Alzheimer's disease research dashboard at Cannakeys looks like. And I'm going to go one slide further to just show you how the weights are easily accessible at a glance. So you have the primary study and related study distinction up here. So for Alzheimer's disease, we have a total of 97 studies, and you may remember the earliest slide said in PubMed there were 118 trials. So the difference between 97 and 118 were false positive. So there were studies that actually had nothing to do with Alzheimer's disease, but for some reason they showed up in the 118 count. Now, of those 97, 43 were related trials, meaning that they did not directly study cannabinoid-based therapeutics or components of the endocannabinoid system in the treatment context of Alzheimer's disease. However, 54 were. Now, and here's the breakdown. On the left are all the clinical studies, on the right are all the preclinical trials. And so this is how you can see the first weight applied at a glance. So the lab trials are down here, and then the clinical trials are on this side. Now, the weight number 2, the key findings, is reflected in the state of the science rating, and so that is one of the context providing tools we work hard to make available for every single condition for which cannabinoid-based therapeutics have been added into the mix, as far as having enough data behind them to warrant a look at, to see if I can pull valuable information from the currently available scientific literature to make more informed and more discerning decision when I'm going to deal with this particular patient that I'm going to see at my 11:15. And so with that in mind, I'm going to pass the baton to my friend and partner, Doug, and let him go from here. Let me unshare this and allow Doug to switch over and take it from here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Uwe. And thanks again to Dr. Jordan Tischler and Margaret, who has helped us get this webinar going, and to the ACS team for having us. And Uwe, thanks for that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, make sure that we can get in here. And now we're coming over, and you should see the Cannakeys website homepage. So as Uwe said, and as Jordan touched on earlier, understanding the science is a challenge, and as Uwe just reflected, it's a significant process to go through at any given moment for any given condition or cannabinoid or terpene to understand what the state of the science is in the moment. And as soon as you do it, that moment is passed, and there's, as Uwe said, we're seeing double-digit studies being published daily. So the evidence is starting to age almost immediately, like a car coming off the lot. And so what we recognized when we were talking about in our early days of the platforms that we were envisioning, it became clear that there was really a need, as Jordan spoke to earlier, to not only have the science out there, and we all celebrate more science, but as the pace of the studies being published increases, what we're seeing is an inability to get to the information that's really the most useful, the most important, and more critically, to get to the insights that we need to get to. So we were building a database of the science to potentially underpin some other platforms. But when some of the cannabis medical groups got wind of what we were doing, they came to us and they were like, when are you going to be offering this? And so that's when we pivoted to create Cannakeys 360. So the platform is, in a nutshell, it's available on subscriptions through our website right now. We're working on other ways to offer the data. And it's per seat subscriptions to allow access to our database of studies. So currently we're a little below 4,500 studies. And again, these are studies that are not false positives. These are high quality studies on the range of studies from lab up to clinical meta-analyses that Uwe mentioned. And you can see that we are adding a lot of studies all the time. The studies are being reviewed by Uwe and our nurse group, and overseen by a doctor who is reviewing our outputs and our studies, looking for any gaps or issues. So we're adding more resources all the time to improve the quality of the information in here and make sure we're complete and up to date. So to come in, so say someone has subscribed, how would they access? So the platform can be accessed here in the menu through Cannakeys 360. You'll see that there are four searches that you can do: medical condition, cannabinoid, terpene, and organ system. We'll touch quickly on all of those today. There's also a user guide that allows users to get some tips and guidance on how to use them. So it's always nice to dip in there for each of the four searches, and for the platform overall, answers a lot of questions on how to use it, plus some tips and tricks and things to note. There's also a glossary of terms for people who are maybe less familiar to the endocannabinoid sciences and see some things in the outputs or in the filtering panel. The glossary is a good place to go. That's also available to non-subscribers as well. And then we have a tutorial for the medical condition video that walks you through roughly what I'm going to do today across all four searches. So you can click on it and you can see the searches as well as the glossary of terms and the user guide. So let's start with the medical condition. So this takes us to our search page. I'm going to make it a little smaller so we can see most of it. And this is just how you would access the medical condition search. So there's a few different ways in. You can select one of the 247 conditions by the drop-down menu. You can type in a keyword, and there's some recent keywords right there. We have some information here, the top 20 condition by the number of clinical primary studies associated with them. So these are all clickable links, but this also tells you where has the science progressed the most, what conditions has it moved forward the most with clinical evidence. So that's just in and of itself a useful bit of information. And then Uwe showed a piece of this, but this is the quick links to all the conditions. So you can kind of review those and click through to ones you might want. So I'm going to come back up here, and if someone's, obviously there's a lot of talk about pain and cannabis, but there's multiple types of pain. And what we try to do is focus in on where the science takes us with specifically what's being researched. So you can see here the pain, different pain specific conditions and diagnoses that come up. So let's go look at chronic pain, a classic one that chronic conditions often have associated, especially if there's inflammation involved. So as Uwe went through, let's go quickly through the components of the output. So as Uwe said, here's the dashboard. You can see the breakdown between the primary and related studies and a total of 250 associated studies for chronic pain. So it's well developed as a condition with regard to the science. And preclinical, there's quite a few, but also very nicely, we can see there's double digit in the trials, as well as 9 clinical meta-analyses. So there's a good bit of data here, but there's also a lot of studies to wade through to find it. So the dashboard is at the top of the page. We'll go through that in a second, and it finishes up at the bottom here with a synopsis. But on the left side here, you can see that there is a filter panel and also some additional ways to search new conditions from here. Looking at the page quick links, below the dashboard, there are primary and related studies by box, and we'll see those in a second. And those are listed chronologically. And at the bottom, there's a condition overview. And we'll take a peek at that, which is just some basic information about the condition, as well as ICD-10 associations. So let's go through the dashboard. So below the overall study breakdown, there is the preclinical and clinical breakdown. And as you mentioned, this is a pretty well advanced condition with regard to the state of the science. So how would we get into that? How would we find and look at especially the most impactful data? So we'll do some filtering in a second to do that. So the balance of the dashboard, there's the state of the science panel, which Uwe mentioned is kind of the weight 2, and it shows kind of the positivity rate for these studies, as well as, is there clinical guidance? Yes, we saw that up above. Is there FDA or EU approved ECS or endocannabinoid therapies? And there is for the EU, there is not for the FDA. We'll look at how we get to those in just a second. And the positivity rate overall is 84%, but for clinical results, it's 90%. So that's a good number for sure. Now, what are they studying? You can see the studies by chemotype. And chemotype, the cannabis chemotypes established in the late 70s, chemotype 1 is high THC, low CBD. Chemotype 2 is roughly balanced ratio, CBD to THC. In our discussions and outreach to people as we were building this, the consensus is around 4:1 to 1:4 of THC to CBD. And then the third is chemotype 3 is high CBD products, high CBD, low or no THC. And you can see if you mouse over, you can see kind of where the direction of the science is, and it's actually quite balanced for this condition. A lot of other conditions, you'll see real focus on one chemotype or others, usually 1 or 3. But this is quite balanced. So they're looking at a number of things. They're actually getting pretty positive rates. Could be a lot of reasons for that. I'll come back up to this panel in a second. We show the countries by studies by country of researcher. And this can be also a single study, can have multiple countries. But oftentimes the US is out front with the research. It's just not out front with the clinical research. And then at the bottom, there's a synopsis that is developed by our team, reviewed by our doctor on the team, that summarizes and in user feedback, this has been a very valuable tool to read through the current summary of the state of the science, basically, so you don't have to, or you can check our data by spot checking the studies. So coming back up to the clinical dosing summary, this shows, and you can see there's little info bubbles here that define some of the things Uwe defined, like clinical and preclinical and related and primary studies. The clinical dosing, what we try to do is show a summary of the clinical dosing information. So this is one of those insights that Jordan mentioned up front, that a summary of the clinical dosing information is just not available if you're reviewing links and compiling PDFs. You're going to have to do it yourself and do it in as the science expands. So by clicking on the clinical dosing information, a new window opens, and what you have here for chronic pain is each one of these rows of the 2 different colors is a study. And for each, you have the title, a summary of the key findings, the form of administration, the dose or doses of what was utilized in the study, and the year of publication, descending chronologically. So you can see here just reviewing what was utilized. So it was dronabinol, here's THC, more delta-9 THC, oral CBD at 10 milligrams, or placebo. And you can scan down, and this will change. This output will change with if you are filtering on specific components. So if you want to just see what the THC clinical dosing is, you'd come over here and you could filter on THC, which we'll show you in just a second. I also wanted to peek at this. This is if you wanted to see what the FDA or EU cannabinoid-based therapeutics are. So you can see in the EU column here, there is pain approved, and these are Bedrocan products. It's a European company who makes products, whole plant extracts based on the 3 chemotypes. So we really like what they're doing because it's really matching up with the main constituents of the plant. It's whole plant, and it's across all 3 chemotypes. So it can be applied to the science as it expands very specifically for different patient groups. So coming down below the dashboard, here's the study lists. And I don't want to spend too much time here. I want to get back up and do some filtering so you can see how they change. But each of these blocks is a study, and you're able to click through to get more details. But just reviewing this, you can see the title, the type of the study, that's primary or related. The relateds are listed below the primary. And you can click through to more details. And from there, click through to the published information that we reviewed to enter the study. So coming back up, and I know I'm going quickly, so please put any questions you have in the chat, and we'll cover those best we can at the end. So obviously, when I usually come, and if a patient asks me about the state of the science and is there any efficacy, or even if doctors call me, which has happened a number of times, to ask me as we were building this, if there's clinical evidence, I want to filter for that. That's often what I will do first. So now you'll see the whole dashboard has changed. We still have the same number of clinical studies. We see that there are 10 related clinical studies to chronic pain for a total of 39. We still have all the dosing information here. The overall positivity rate is 90 because we're just looking at clinical. And as you can see here, you can see that they're looking clinically mostly at THC, which makes sense if you're familiar with these. And coming down here, now you can see you're just looking at clinical studies. So let me just grab one of these. The sigils that you'll see show that there is either a subratio in the XY, that's a subratio for the chemotypes, because for example, CBD, that is high CBD, low THC, but how high? What's the difference between the two? A subratio will tell you. Is it 20 to 1? Is it 1 to 0? What is that? And MG means that there's dosing information. And if there's not, it means that it wasn't available to us because we review the full studies whenever possible, and we're looking to do that for every study we review. It's also, I will note that on the click-throughs, we don't drill through any paywalls. So you will see the free information that's available on PubMed or other platforms that we link to. So here's the information, the details that we click through on this clinical study. So you can see the key findings. It's a double-blind study, 180, so a good solid sample size. They used CBD and THC, but they used chemotype 3 and chemotype 2, so not a high THC chemotype. So you can see there's the subratios, a 10 to 1 CBD, a 1 to 0, and a 4 to 1. So they would both fall into chemotype 2 and 3. And you can see the dosing information here. It's a Danish study from 2019. And if you click on the link to the study, it brings you up to the study that you can actually review it for yourself and see what the detail is, pull out anything or cite it if you're writing a paper or something else. So really the goal here is for us to try to not only create more efficiency in finding the science, but also to find ways to bring some insights quickly so you can find just what you need. So again, we've already filtered for clinical. Let's filter for THC and see what that looks like, focusing in on the most prominent cannabinoids. So you can see there's still some chemotype 2 and 3 involved in some of these. So they're looking at multiple chemotypes. You can see that the studies have filtered down. Now there's 13 studies. So let's look at the clinical dosing again, because it's filtered it now. So now we're looking at just studies that involve THC. So that's a quick way to look at it, though it includes things like Sativex and some of the Bedrocan studies that are blends of THC and CBD. But this is in just a couple of clicks, you've gone from 250 studies to 19 that are clinical and utilize THC for chronic pain. I'm going to clear the filter. I'm going to move along so we can touch on the other studies and have time for questions. I will just peek down at the chronic pain. This is at the bottom of the study list. So you can see we have a description. We have synonyms and symptoms. The synonyms are also tested in the keyword search. We have disease classifications across which systems that we associate with. And there's also a clickable ICD-10 association. We do have this information about drug interactions. This is not condition or search specific, but overall, we're looking to expand that and be more specific and targeted with drug interactions and potentially a search there for them by pharmaceutical. We also have, based on the clinical results that we've seen, created these considerations or ranges for what we consider a micro to high dose of THC and a low to high dose of CBD. So I'm going to go to the little button here, go to the top again, and let's go to another search. So let's go to cannabinoids. So this is, we're starting to look at the science of the specific components within, within cannabis or some other compounds as well. So very similarly, you can pick from the drop down. You can see the top 20 cannabinoids by clinical studies. Not surprisingly, THC and CBD are out front. We look at the and associate the pharmaceutical preparations by chemotype, because that's all there is right now. They're looking at either THC or CBD or a combination of those. But we're tracking those as well, and we'll likely start to get specific science of specific pharmaceuticals, which will be, of course, helpful to doctors and caregivers. We also, you can see there's some endocannabinoids in here as well, and some of their the key enzymes. And to really get a sense of what's here and what groups there are, you can come down to the bottom for these click-throughs. We have the phytocannabinoids of cannabis and other plants as well. The endocannabinoids, or endogenous or internal cannabinoids, as well as a couple of key enzymes, for the main ones being Fa and Mogl, which are the degrading enzymes for anandamide and 2-AG respectively. As I said, the pharmaceutical preparations based on chemotype. We also have the synthetic cannabinoids, which are prominently used in research for the most part, but also show up on the street. And it's important, we feel, to understand this and understand the science of the endocannabinoid system. And that's why we don't just have cannabis here, but across every compounds that have science that interact with our receptor sites and endocannabinoid system. And we also have some plant compounds, and we're tracking a number of others, echinaceas in there now, but there's emerging research on a number of other compounds. So I'm going to come back here and go to CBD so you can see one of the biggies. So there's 1,156 total studies. So again, what would you do with this? There's a lot here, but let's take a look at some of the key differences in the dashboard. We break down, since we're not doing chemotypes, we're looking at a single component. We do studies by organ system for this. So most of the research is in nervous system across the board, not surprising here, but also mental, emotional for CBD, that's not surprising, digestive, integumentary, immune, etc. Countries by research, there's the US, 332, followed by Italy and the UK. Down here, we have the receptor sites associated with CBD studies. CB1 and CB2 are out front, but of course, there's also other receptor groups like the TRP receptors and PPARs. So PPAR gamma and TRPV1 often seen, as well as another G protein coupled receptor 55 shows up in a lot of research. Now, some insights into CBD and the science of it. What are the top conditions, just by sheer numbers, that are using CBD for research? Well, not surprisingly, you see epilepsy out front, multiple sclerosis, inflammation, anxiety, chronic pain, psychosis, schizophrenia. So not too surprising there. But coming down here, this is very useful. This is CBD has shown proven effects in clinical trials for these conditions. So if you want to know very quickly at a glance, what is CBD proven to work for, is shown to work for in clinical trials, here's your conditions. So let me just show you, if you wanted to say, well, gosh, that's great, I want to dig into one of those conditions and how does CBD work for, the best way to do it is actually to use one of these live links. And my favorite disease, of course, as Jordan mentioned out front, I've been working with Crohn's disease on that path for many, many years. So you would click on this and then come down and filter on CBD. So moving back and forth between the searches, you'll find is how, so some better ways to get into the science. And you can see here quickly by filtering it, there's some CBD associated clinical evidence, but there's not a whole heck of a lot actually, which I can say from experience, but you can see that some of it is quite guiding, including that low dose CBD is safe but not effective for the treatment of Crohn's. And also we found that there's, we were looking at this study the other day and talking about it before we started, that the resulting data for CBD induced significant clinical and quality of life improvement, but there were no changes in inflammatory parameters or endoscopic scores. So it didn't get to the core disease. It really didn't help move toward, at least at this dose and with this chemotype and this form of administration, toward remission, but it did have significant quality of life, measurable quality of life benefits. So I'm going to jump back up And I think we showed everything in the cannabinoid search, but I'm just going to hop back over. Okay, here we go. So you can also filter on things like the clinicals here to say, well, what's the scope of the clinical evidence for CBD? And giving that a couple of beats, 184 primaries, 184 clinical primary studies looking at CBD. And if you said, all right, well, I want to look and see specifically, I'm a gastroenterologist, I want to understand CBD for the digestive system. So filtering these, coming down here, and what's interesting is that when it filters, it shows you what is the conditions where there is clinical evidence for CBD for the digestive system. So you can see these cancer pain, which covers all systems, unfortunately, but also colitis, Crohn's, IBD, nausea and vomiting, et cetera. So again, there are quick ways to filter in and get larger insights. Then I could click through any of those conditions and do some filtering. So to keep things moving, jump over to the terpene search. Similar to the cannabinoid search, you can grab something from the dropdown. You can come here and look at the top terpenes by clinical studies, or you can look at the all the quick links here for the terpenes that we have. We're mainly looking at terpenes associated with cannabis, but we're expanding the science within those and reviewing many others. We're looking at Borneol here, the science of Borneol. It's actually advanced to some degree, a small number of clinical studies. And this is very identical dashboard that you would see to cannabinoids with the studies by researcher, top conditions, and receptor sites associated with it. We're just looking at one of the trips here. And those clinical studies, generalized pain, middle ear infection, and stroke and cerebral infarction for this terpene. And coming down here, you could see the research is the same way. So if you wanted to say, well, gosh, I really want to look at those clinicals, coming down here, they're still here, obviously. And then you would see not only those 3 primary ones, but also some larger studies that are related. And in this case, with terpenes and also with cannabinoids, a related study, unlike a condition that might be mentioned, but isn't a primary, related studies for CBD or other cannabinoids or terpenes, that might mean and usually means that they are minor constituents in the study. So if it was a lavender oil, that's obviously going to have a large amount of linalool in it, but it might have minor cannabinoids or terpenes in it. And in this case, Borneol was one of those that was mentioned in the study. And we would associate that with it, but it wouldn't get a primary association. So that's why it's a related study for this minor component that was studied in this case. And then like the other outputs, there's an overview at the bottom with description, both a physical and an overview with some synopsis information in there, scent description, as well as some strains that are high in Borneol where we could find tested results, and a summary of the effects, very, again, similar to the condition synopsis. So I'm going to move over to the organ system search. So this is our kind of big view search. These are the organ systems that we search, nervous system down to urinary system. We do include a mental emotional system. You can't study the mind-body effects and the emotional effects of cannabis and endocannabinoid therapies without looking at those. But I'm going to peek at the digestive system since we've already kind of looked at that a little bit. So again, this would be that look from a gastroenterologist or someone who's just dealing with digestive issues, maybe doesn't have a diagnosis yet. And the thing to note here is these are the studies that we associate with the system. So these are the conditions that we have flagged to it. So just at a glance, you can see these are the digestive system conditions that where there is some science and that we've associated with the system. And all of these science together that are associated with these conditions show up in the search. And the same is true for the other organ system or the other organ system searches in the data bank. But you can see at a glance, again, there's chemotype information that gives you a clue kind of where the research is going, but you could quickly filter on chemotype. You can filter on the type of study. the cannabinoid or endocannabinoid, and these are filterable across all the searches. The terpenes, and these only show up if there is something to filter for. So even just at a glance at the outset for any search, you can see what's there. So for a condition with few studies, there'll be fewer things to filter on. The receptor sites that are noted in the studies, as well as ligands, which are like cytokines, anti-inflammatory, inflammatory cytokines, or serotonin, or different neurotransmitters. Coming to understand those in the long view is what endocannabinology is going to be about as it develops toward being a specialty. You can also just say, well, what are the positive studies? Or on the flip side, you could say, what are the negative studies? Where did the condition worsen with these? And you could find potentially some contraindications for whatever was utilized within the study. And if you wanted to look at either really new studies, just this year or last year, or really old studies going back into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you can limit and filter by the study duration, like when they were published. So I know that's a lot there, but this is a complex, it's a complex system, and it's a complex application to try to utilize cannabis with some focus for patients. And so what we try to do is we try to take these large data sets of human derived, we're reading the studies and entering this information, and we wanted to try to find the best ways for folks like yourself, doctors, nurses, practitioners who are supporting patients, and find quick ways to find not only the studies that are most impactful for your decisions in working with a patient, but also those quick insights, and especially contrasting dosing information. So with that, I'd love to pass it over to Jordan, and we can get into some questions. And I'll leave the share open for a moment while we do that, and we'll see if we get questions about going back in anywhere.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. That was really enlightening. And as you can see in the chat box, there are a few questions, but mostly great praise for what you guys have accomplished. So thank you for this presentation.
Great.
I have pulled together some of the questions that have come up, many of which I must admit come from myself. So let's dive in a little bit.
Great.
My first question actually was probably best addressed to Uwe, which is, I didn't really follow the math in the second weighting part of your description. And it seems to me that that's really a crucial distinction. So could you go over that again for me?
Sure.
Uwe, do you want to share, or can you just?
Yeah, let me just get the slide back. And share the screen.
It was that one there, yeah.
So the first weight's pretty self-explanatory, right? So
Right.
we have Petri dish getting the lowest weights, and the meta-analyses of clinical trials getting the highest weight. So we associate the first weight with each trial that's entered. Now, the second weight is determined by the key findings of the study. Is the study saying it helps with the underlying pathology of Alzheimer's disease? It get, if it was an animal trial, it gets multiplied by a +1. If it says it made it worse, whatever the first weight was gets multiplied by a -1. And if it was mixed or inconclusive results, it gets multiplied by a 0. And so here, is a representation of the last time I actually went through each of the individual trials. So there were, all of these showed potential efficacy regarding aspects of the underlying pathology. 2 trials came in with mixed or inconclusive results. So when we multiply the first weight by a +1, we're ending up with 9. Mm-hmm. And in the case of a double blind, there were 5 total, but only 3 indicated, positive results. 2 indicated mixed inconclusive. So 3 times 5 is 15. You add all of these up, you get 89, and you divide that total by the total number of trials, And then you end up with a number between 1 and 6, which roughly corresponds to possible, probable, or actual evidence for efficacy for this particular patient population.
Okay, so with the double-blind trials, there were 5 of them. So 3 of them got multiplied by +1, and 2 of them got multiplied by 0. So how do we get 15 out of that? That would seem to me
3 times 5.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's not really multiplying by 0, or that would be 0.
Right.
But yeah.
And so essentially what you're doing is you're saying the weight of the evidence here is in the plus column as opposed to the negative column or the in-between column. And
that's right. And there are other conditions. For example, if I remember correctly, right now there are about, little more than a handful of conditions for which the currently available science indicates a potential negative results. And some of them were like, for example, one particular type of testicular cancer, certain arrhythmias like afluttering, AFib, pancreatitis, pericarditis, and pregnancy. Those are what I remember off the top, where this was resulting in actual negative results, indicating potential contraindications based on what the science is reflecting to us now. Now, these numbers may change as other studies offer more complexity and intricacy, that allows us to determine, well, like, for example, with pancreatitis, one of the things has become clear that cannabinoid-based therapeutics tend to make things worse in the second part of an inflammatory phase, while giving it in the initial inflammatory phase actually makes it better. So it was a phase-specific negative results. And so as we get more background information, we'll be able to determine more clearly what type of cannabis constituents are to be used at what phase of a particular disease expression. Same is true for sepsis. There's some interesting research coming around in sepsis, when in general, when you put it all together, it looks like the cannabis-based therapeutics may not be that useful, but if you take it apart, it tells you certain types of cannabis constituents are very useful at certain portions of disease expression. And so it gets very nuanced and it gets very complex, but we love complexity because it is complexity that allows us to make more informed and discerning decisions and optimize patient outcomes. And so, in a way, we're looking at a limitation of using statistics, but also at the same time, they highlight the importance of both taking the bird's eye view and then diving in and taking it apart and pulling out the information that gives you the most impact in the clinical setting.
Right. I think that's absolutely helpful. So the next question is, in the search engine, essentially on the dashboard, is there a way in which one can discern whether the weight of the evidence primarily comes from pharmaceutical approaches like the research that we've seen from GW versus that which is done with good old cannabis?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't, I believe, have a filter currently for the cannabinoid source, which is, I believe, what you're getting at, whether it is hemp CBD, or whether it is an isolate, or whether it's a whole plant. But we do track that with the science, and it does show up in the specific study details when you click through to it. So we do track that, whether it's available. It's become more available in the literature. A lot in the older studies, they did not mention where they got the cannabis from or much detail there, but now that's obviously become much more of interest. But obviously, if you want to look at the pharmaceutical studies, you would look at those pharma chemotypes searches in the cannabinoid search. But we don't have, there's some macro searches that we're considering of the whole data bank. The biggest ones you can get to are looking right now at the organ systems. But we're looking at thinking some macro searches to be able to look at the source, which I believe you're getting to. And but right now that information is somewhat spotty, especially with the older studies.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. I guess I was just thinking, like, if I'm looking at the dashboard, I guess really what I'm saying is it's very clear that the data I'm looking for or talking about is in the system. It's how quickly and what kind of conclusions would I draw by sort of the glance at the dashboard. And for example, one could easily glance at a dashboard and say, okay, I'm only interested in randomized controlled trials in human beings. That's great. We got that immediately there. But one could say, oh, look, there are 2 randomized controlled trials and the result is generally positive. But am I talking about, Sativex, or am I talking about weed, right? And that I think would be helpful for we as clinicians, because most of us aren't working with Sativex. The literature from Sativex is very interesting, from an academic point of view, but if we're dealing with state legal cannabis as the agent, then the question is how applicable is GW's research to, Maui Wowie or whatever, right?
Right.
So that was just one question.
I mean, I would say the best way to do that would be if you're thinking about these questions for a specific condition, I would search the database for that condition. I would search for filter by the clinical evidence. Then I would filter for the phytocannabinoids, not filtering for the pharmaceuticals. And that would filter out the Sativexes and dronabinols, and you would just get the phytos of cannabis. There is a relatively newly added phytocannabinoid only search, which is a cannabis search. So you can, in 2 clicks for a given condition, filter on the clinical evidence and then clinical just on phytocannabinoids. So that's the fastest way to get rid of that. So yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
I just remembered that relatively newly add.
So here's a question that I had that actually dovetails into somebody else's question. You guys have clearly stated that meta-analyses get your top weighting, and in many ways, meta-analyses are in fact very helpful because they look across studies. But of course, as a result, their Achilles heel is that they're only as good as their inclusion and exclusion criteria, which often then reflects the biases of the researchers themselves. And so, how do you guys, are you essentially taking the quality of the meta-analyses sort of at face value, or is there any way in which you guys are sort of what's the word I'm looking for, weighting how well that meta-analysis was actually done?
Uwe, you want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah. We in order to keep our bias at an absolute minimum, we can't get rid of researcher bias based on the studies that we enter. I mean, those studies have been done, and so they're being entered with the bias that comes from its source. But what we do want to do, we want to be committed to reflecting the science as it comes in, and not interpret or try to pull information that we think ought to be associated or is apparent to us. We, as much as we want to, there's many times when I enter a trial, and to me, there are a number of association that they didn't make based on this or study findings, but I can clearly make, and I'm itching to say that and to put that in and to share that with everyone. But I have to hold myself back just because from the get-go we set out to keep our bias in check, and by only reporting on the science as it is being presented. just to be as objective as possible, fully knowing that every study, is coming with a degree of bias. And, there's not much we can do about it, but to reflect it. Now, our belief is that the more studies are entered into a particular or associated with a particular condition, eventually it's just going to be a matter of time till the truth emerges. It's just, my faith in science that eventually the early treatment trends that are born out of the narrative on the war on drugs, have been, slowly but surely have been shifted and changed away. Like the whole discussion about, is cannabis an entry drug or is it an exit drug? And now, after 30, 40 years of studies, that discussion and the scientific evidence clearly indicates that cannabis constituents, when given appropriately, can be very effective as an exit drug. And so I ultimately, my faith in science is going to lean in the direction of hoping that any and all bias will eventually be at least mitigated by new data, by new trials, by new information.
I would just add briefly that we had considered adding some insights that would, say, draw some conclusions from the science. And we reconsidered that. We got some feedback from some early doctors who were beta testing it and reviewing it with us. And we ended up taking that out because we wanted to ultimately avoid drawing those conclusions for the user. And we wanted the user to be able to quickly find the science and see some aggregation of the science, and ultimately more quickly find what they want so they can draw their own conclusions. And again, at the heart of what Uwe was saying is that we're following the science. And if it is a target, a primary, or a good related association, we're going to associate them so people can review them and draw their own conclusions.
That sounds quite reasonable. One of our listeners had then asked the related question, given the fact that you have a cadre of nurses and a supervising physician who helps make some of these determinations and also writes the synopses, how are you managing the objectivity and the process that develops that consensus between the reviewers? And how is that sustainable given the rate at which you've pointed out that new science is becoming available?
Yeah, these are some of our questions too. I mean, we are putting a fair amount of resources back into this area. It's the core of what we do with this platform. And we're discussing with the doctor. Uwe and I have had a couple of meetings in the past couple of weeks with him. We're reviewing the output and the input work that people are doing. So we are double checking and making sure that how things are characterized or how the key findings are supported are appropriate and focused. But then we're also stepping into, we're moving into more technical areas to apply some algorithms to help us find the studies, which we would then, there would be apply the human element of review. So we're looking at some technical solutions to help us manage the increasing flow of studies, but we're also using more internal discussion and processes to manage both the correctness and potential bias in decision making.
And to add, most of the data entry process is objective. It's just literally pulling data points and providing the key findings of the study and pulling the key elements that then become filterable in the future for the user. And so all of these are objective. There's no subjectivity. There's no interpretation. The only thing that is the synopsis is a reflection of all of those data points condensed, if you will. They're the distilled information. They're the essence of all the key findings. and it's not very hard to keep it as objective as possible. Literally just merging the key findings into a narrative that's concise and precise and as reflective as possible of the currently available scientific literature.
Okay. And then I had one other, I'm not entirely sure it's a question, it's almost more of a comment. Doug, when you were presenting, you had shown a box in the dashboard that was entitled something like proven effects.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered whether, my impression when I saw that was that that essentially that was interpreted, or at least I interpreted it to mean sort of proven positive effect. And so I sort of wondered whether somebody glancing at that might sort of come away with the impression that all of those lists of conditions had really sort of proven clinical benefit from cannabis or some cannabinoid. As opposed to what I think you guys mean was really that in that field, there was some notable data.
My understanding of that, and it's a great question, and I can certainly see how people could have slightly different takeaways from it. My understanding is that is positive results. But as we looked quickly at that Crohn's study, you can have a positive rating because it supported condition or symptom improvement, but wasn't necessarily, curative or moving the condition toward remission in this case. So, it might be worth us taking a look at that. I have a note to get the language potentially a bit more precise, or at least something that could be
I would
not construed broadly, but it is for positive results.
Okay, that's actually interesting. The issue with positive results in any aggregate, of course, is that, if you have enough positive results, you can also mask a whole lot of negative results, right?
Right.
And negative results, of course, can fall into it didn't show anything, or it showed something significantly, problematic. And the problematic things would be great to be aware of, even in the context of sort of the preponderance of evidence being positive.
And from if you're trying to find those, the way to do that is to look at the condition search and specific conditions, and then you can filter for that positive, negative, or if it did nothing, or the results were inconclusive, or they were mixed. And that mixed is interesting because we had to include that because you'll have some results that could be positive, but also maybe there was a contraindication in there as well,
Exactly.
or it was just so mixed there, they couldn't draw a conclusion. So it really was inconclusive, but it would be the medical condition search where you would dig into that.
Got it. I wonder whether maybe some of these things could be represented in some fashion on that dashboard, because I suspect that a fair number of our users are going to, I hate to say this, sort of stop at the dashboard. And of course, we like and expect people to drill, as you point out, but I wonder to what degree we might find, it's like on any website, people look at the home page and then some people will click through the links, but other people will.
Well, we do have some data on that, actually. We just finished, January was this year was our 1-year anniversary of launching. And so in February, we did a subscriber user survey. And we asked that specific question: how often do people click through to the individual study and or through to the published data? And always or most of the time was about 2/3 of the respondents.
Oh, that's lovely.
Which was great. Yeah, that was really great to see, because the dashboard insights are really useful, but they're kind of compass headings. They're not, we don't see them as places to make conclusions. But again, through the filtering that I showed and through the ability to look at a group of studies together and read at least the headlines and some basic information, then you can kind of guide you to the specific studies you might want to go, either through further filtering or checking that 12 clinical studies that came up with your filtering. So it is nice to see that the vast majority of the people are looking at individual studies.
Absolutely. You know, I think that the word proven is a very complicated one in medicine because it gets into this question of sort of like, you know, how much evidence do you need? What's the quality of the evidence that you need? Where does human expertise fall in there? And I mean, I think we look at things like the Cochrane Institute, right, who have tried to define that in a very rigorous way, but at the same time, is that applies to the cannabis world, almost nothing even meets its basic basic standard. So you sort of left with the impression that there's no good evidence in the cannabis world. And from the Cochrane's point of view, they could say, yeah, that's true. On the other hand, for the rest of us who are looking at this, who have to be a little bit more flexible about what evidence you know, we would expect. We would like it to reach the Cochrane level, but we're having to do with what we have. So I think, you know, proven is really something that I might suggest requires both multiple concordant studies plus a general consensus of experts. And, you know, I don't know that we really have anything that matches that at this point in the cannabis world. But of course, you know, there's some element of the semantic argument that I'm making, but it's also an area where your product can also help bring that to fruition by highlighting multiple concordant studies and then possibly leading to discussions of expert consensus.
It's great feedback. And I have notes. We're going to look at that and make sure it's outputting what we want to output and kind of, well, I think we should revisit the articulation of it, but what you're saying about bringing the greater insight, we want to do that but to the extent that we're not interpreting the science beyond where we're comfortable. So we maintain objectivity.
Absolutely agree. Actually, I'm really sort of talking off the top of my head here, but maybe there's a future direction here in which you convene some sort of a panel of recognized experts. Perhaps the ACS could be part of that process with or for you, in which then we could have an added layer that talks about the expert consensus based on the data that has been presented through the search engine.
That would be fantastic. I'd love to explore something like that because, yeah, to have people utilize the platform and collectively draw some opinions and have that be known who those people are. Yeah, the value there would be tremendous, especially as the science becomes more robust.
There is an organization called the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, and they do these sorts of things for general primary care medicine on a periodic basis. And I find that that's very useful. They look at the data, they grade the data, and then they come up with a recommendation for clinical practice based on that data. So it's both science and expertise, and it's very transparent. I'm sure there's politics involved, of course, but I think, you know, that would be an interesting sort of next step that we could explore.
Yeah, I did see that there was another question. Cheryl had a couple of questions. And Jordan, if it's okay, I could tackle those.
Yeah, I thought I had kind of folded them in there, but if you want to take.
Well, there was one specifically, which was about tables not having references.
Right.
And it is true if you're looking, say, at the dosing table or something like that, really the expectation would be that the dashboard reflects the study list below it. So say if you had a search to condition and filtered by clinical only, and the clinical dosing data was there, you would find those studies below. Now, there wouldn't be a one-to-one, you would kind of have to mix and match, and that's why we show the study title in the dosing output. But it's a good point to try for us to be mindful to try to make sure we're connecting things for people in a clear way. But again, like when I did the second filter on the specific cannabinoid THC and it tightened up the list, it also tightened up the study list below. So there is some contrast there. And again, we're trying to be faithful purveyors of the science to show a completeness to it. But it's a good point and something for us to keep in mind with the referencing.
I actually had a related question, which is I had noticed that in some screens you had shown the articles which said, the title and the year and publication and stuff like that. What I didn't see on that screen was the list of authors. And I find, having been at this for a little while, that in many cases I've gotten to know the authors, maybe not individually or personally, but at least through their research. And there are certain researchers who I've come to know are so biased that I tend to, there's a particular researcher at Yale who I find incomprehensible, but so helpful to me as I read the title of the study to say, oh yeah, that's that guy. All right, fine. No.
Yeah, it is in retrospect a data point that we kicked around at the beginning of this process that we should grab, and we determined not to. And we also didn't grab another one that we would maybe like to go back in time on is the journal as well. So to be able to grab the journal and the authors, those are things we're considering. I mean, 4,500 studies is a lot, but we have some methodologies that we could apply that could do that. Take a little time, but we could put those in. And we've identified that the journal, and some feedback we've received, is a way to moderate quality question, because obviously some journals publishing is considered more prestigious or more important and more high quality than others. So that in and of itself is a little bit of a quality measure that we're not placing any bias in, but if we presented that, it would give y'all a clue as to the quality of the study in question. But yeah, the authors is a good piece of feedback, and we are thinking about adding that. But the way that you would get that right now is click through to the study,
Sure.
and that's how you'd see it.
I think this has been a great presentation of a great product. I'm really excited to have this available to our members and to use it myself. And thank you, gentlemen, for presenting it today. Somebody adds that potentially adding impact factor to your weighting might be interesting. I think that that's an interesting idea. I'm personally a little bit concerned about impact factor. I feel like there's a certain politics that's sort of embedded in their heuristic, but it is what's out there at the moment. And so you certainly might either consider it or add it, and for what it's worth, kind of thing.
It has been discussed. It was raised in the beta process, and for your very reasons, we considered it, but we decided not to go forward with it. But it's certainly something that we're continuing to talk about, because we're always looking for ways to add more value, more insight, and more direction. So, but thank you, Jordan, Margaret, everybody at ACS, and for everybody joining today. We're pleased to offer a 30% discount through ACS to ACS members. So if you haven't joined, if you're not a member, consider it. And we're excited to work with you guys going forward and potentially look at some of the things you mentioned, Jordan.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for your time today. Thank you, everybody, for coming and listening and participating. And we will all be in touch with the next announcements from the ACS. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day.
Great.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.